Well, as you know, the history of Western civilization is the history, really, of one religion. It's a religion that basically provided the ethos and the founding principles and virtues that we based our American society on. And as you know, as we all know, the name of this religious group is Easter worshippers. Hi, everybody. I'm Bill Whittle here with Steve Green and Scott Ott. And if those of you who were Christians or thought you were Christians or maybe know some Christians, turns out you're in error. You're not a Christian. You are an Easter worshiper. And we can prove it because during the horrific attacks on Easter worshippers in Sri Lanka over the Easter weekend, we have, let's just see, thanks to our friend Steve Green, who is actually well educated about these things, we can go to this little handy little Twitter page and find out that Barack Obama says that the attack on tourists and Easter worshippers in Sri Lanka, the Hillary Clinton on this holy weekend, everyone is affected by today's horrific attacks on Easter worshippers, and a number of other Democrats. None of them seem worthy of the horrific attack of Easter worshippers. That's Greg Stanton. Jared Polis says, heartbreaking to learn the attacks on tourists and Easter worshippers in Sri Lanka. And Representative Dan Kildee, such a horrific terror attack on Easter worshippers. Now, why is it that Christians, because it was an attack on Christians in a Christian church on Easter, why are they being called Easter worshippers? Well, it turns out there's a very good reason for that, and the person who really put the nails into it is our friend Richard the Cat, who I've been an enormous fan of since I started writing Eject, 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 who tweets with a perfect explanation, and that is this, gentlemen. The strategy is to win the battle of association. Associate Christianity with perversion, patriotism with racism, free enterprise with cruelty, etc. And who's doing the virtue signaling? Why, the heirs of Stalin. So, if you have a confused look on your face why you're no longer a Christian and are suddenly an Easter worshiper, the answer is because Christians are oppressors, you see. And if there's a catastrophe where Christians are slaughtered by, let's just say some people did some things, Christians cannot be victims because that would generate sympathy for Christians. So in order to make sure that no sympathy is generated for this massacre of Christians on Easter Sunday, we have a regrettable occurrence where Easter worshippers have apparently had some things were done to them by some people. Steve, what do you think? You think that holds up? I think it holds up perfectly well. It's kind of like, Steve, there's this tremendous sex scandal with a politician, and we don't know what party he's from, which means he's a Democrat.
Yeah, and if he's a Republican, it's right there in, 24-point type boldface in the headline, and then repeated in the lead and every other paragraph after that. We saw something similar happen with the Jews, and I don't mean in Hitler's Germany. I mean here in the rest of the West in the 1980s and 90s and onward. And it was to once they become oppressors themselves after
right.
having fought a couple of defensive wars and taking some land from the states that launched those wars of aggression. So Israelis were now oppressors, and there was this attempt to differentiate between our Jews who are good, even though they don't actually believe that, as we see anti-Semites starting to take over the Democratic Party, and those Jews over there, they're Zionists, and that became that became the code word to separate Jews from their religion. So their religion that is a part of this country, so that we could make them the bad guys of the Middle East. All evidence to the contrary. So we've seen this playbook before. It's nothing new. The crassness of this one is a little shocking. The immediacy of it. You remember the journo-list? It was a listserv with a bunch of.
I'm glad you brought that up. I would like to hear your insider baseball explanation for why it is that all of a sudden major Democratic operatives all across the planet are referring to Easter worshippers.
Exactly.
A term I've never heard of before.
Me either. And nobody who used. There were a few Democrats who said Christians, but none of the Democrats who used this phrase Easter worshippers used the word Christians. So some smart guy with a journo-list type operation came up with this phrase, again, to separate Americans from their religion so that can be the bad guy. What's really telling here is after the horrible attacks in New Zealand last month, where Muslims were murdered in their churches by this madman who was actually from Australia. These Sri Lanka attacks were supposedly, at least this is the claim, in retribution for that. And I'll tell you that uh, after the New Zealand attacks, the mosque attacks there, Barack Obama expressed his solidarity, and I believe this is his exact quote, with the global Muslim community. There it is. He said it right out loud. So we know Muslims have to be the victims. We know that Christians have to be the bad guy because that's the narrative they have to set to win power back.
Correct. And when we talked about the massacre and when I did the firewall on the massacre, we identified that these were innocent Muslims who were being gunned
Absolutely.
down in cold-blooded murder by a monster who doesn't
For their
deserve
faith.
the appellation of human. Yes, exactly. Scott, you're an Easter worshiper, and your strong worship of Easter over the course of many years has been an example not only to me. I'm serious about this. It's your Easter worshiping has been an example to me and to many other people. And I know I'm trying to sound like it's flip, but I'm dead serious. What is it about the worship of Easter that provides you with such a strong moral core to get you through times like this here in America today?
This is a story that has political overtones, but it goes so far beyond politics, so far beyond our current day. As I mentioned in our backstage episode, if you would expect President Barack Obama, who has self-identified as a Christian, that he would profess solidarity and prayers for his brothers and sisters in Christ in Sri Lanka, who suffered and died in this terrible slaughter. That would be the natural expression of a believer for his fellow believers. It would be unfeigned. It would roll trippingly from the tongue. It would be just what you would expect him to say. But he didn't say that.
We did say international sympathy with our sympathy with international Muslim movement or whatever. That rolled trippingly off the tongue.
There is a problem. I mean, fundamentally, I think that the cat's suggestion was correct. You can't identify Christians with being part of an oppressed or beleaguered group in any way, because that conjures up sympathy for Christians, and you certainly don't want that, since they are the dominant oppressor of the world today and throughout history, frankly. So that runs afoul of their intention and how they want to couch their PR campaign to benefit progressivism. But there's another element to this, like to even say Easter worshiper, like perhaps if you're outside of the church, so to speak, it's not immediately clear, but anybody who has professed faith in Jesus Christ, who has come to a place where they have trusted Jesus for their salvation, they have been cleansed of their sins, they've been united together with him in eternity. That kind of person doesn't worship church. They don't worship Sunday. In fact, more often than not, my fellow evangelical Christians will refer to Resurrection Sunday. Easter is actually a word that kind of has some Germanic origins and may refer to a goddess of spring.
Starting.
Yeah. So, but we think in terms of the resurrection. But interestingly enough, we don't worship the resurrection. We're not miracle worshipers. We're not people who bow down at the stone that rolled away from the face of the tomb. What we worship is God become man, who is still fully God. We worship a person, Jesus Christ. And that has been, for centuries, an offense to almost every other religion and everybody outside of religions in the world. And so to publicly make that profession and to identify this event at this key moment, I mean, I think whoever the bombers were made a grievous error in the timing of this, because what they have done is they've drawn attention to the crucifixion and the resurrection of a person who is God in human flesh, who has come to save the world. And instead, that should be the last thing they want on the tongues of people around the world. They should be, because if it turns out to be Islamic bombers, they believe that Jesus was just another prophet, and any belief that he died and rose from the dead is really twisted. They should have wanted to avoid this, but for some reason they were inexorably drawn to commit an act of terror that highlights the glory of God in Jesus Christ. And as horrible as it is, I thank God for the opportunity that it has given believers around the world to be able to share their testimony.
You know, I do a lot of public speaking events. I've done hundreds of them, and they're obviously all either for Republican groups or Tea Party groups or something like that. And I don't think in the hundreds that I've done, I don't think there's more than 3 or 4 that did not have the Pledge of Allegiance and or an invocation. Virtually all of them had both. And when I would begin speaking, I would usually start by saying, just as a quick side note, for those of you that may not be aware of it, the reason that we start these events with an invocation and the Pledge of Allegiance is out of it's a security measure, not a measure of respect. It's a security measure because if there's any progressives in the audience, their skin will burst into flames, and a large hole will open in the floor directly in front of us, and sulfurous fumes will come out, and they'll be grabbed by the ankles and pulled back down to their underground sugar caves. Now, I'm serious as I can be about this. I have over the years, and I was obviously I'm trying to make a point here, but the truth of the matter is my association with people like Scott Ott and many other people I respect enormously has made me much more of an Easter worshiper than I was when I certainly began this business. And the cynicism level of this, the just the sheer insult of it, you might as well be basically saying they're golden calf worshipers. Just that alone is insulting enough. The assumption that we're too stupid to see it is insulting as well. And I have, of course, no doubt that if there were, the analogy would be if there was a terror attack on the 4th of July, any number of 4th of July celebrants might have been killed in a bomb in Europe, let's say, but they sure couldn't have been Americans because the Democratic Party and the progressives have determined that the enemies of the country are, as our friend Richard says, is patriotism, Christianity, and free enterprise. Those are the enemies of the country. Associate Christianity with perversion, patriotism with racism, free enterprise with cruelty. And who's doing the virtue signaling? He says the heirs of Stalin, the people who have 200 million bloody deaths on their hands. And that's why we're here. We're here to fight this kind of invisible bigotry that convinces you over the course of 10 or 20 or 30 years that you're insane and the last person who believes in anything, and that you're an Easter worshiper, when in point of fact you're not an Easter worshiper or a 4th of July celebrant. You are a Christian or an American or maybe neither, but in any event you know what you are, and you don't like being told by a bunch of mealy-mouthed progressive liars that you are not what you think you are, because it would be disadvantageous for the world to realize that you had actually been suffering. Miserable, low-life swine. That's what they are. This show is made possible by you, the paying members at BillWhittle.com, for whom we are, I almost said eternally grateful, and then I censored myself, and then I recensored myself. Probably will be eternally grateful. Thanks to you for your kind words and good work keeping this enterprise going, and we'll see you next week right here on Right Angle.